Hello, and welcome to another exciting tutorial in Maya 2017, where today we're going to be talking all about rendering. Now, it's important that we're going to be using Arnold as our main renderer today, and of leaving you guys a scene that to set up, I'm going to go over here and choose Set Project, and I'm going to select the Render Layers Projects folder, which I'll leave available for you guys on Google Drive. If you want to download it, check out the show notes below. And then I'm going to open up one of my scenes over here, which you'll have available to you, which is Render Layers version 1. I'm going to hit Don't Save to this, and let's open up this file over here. So it's a very simple scene of just some basic objects, one of them which has some textures that we made in a previous tutorial. The bottle makes a little appearance as well, and I've got three little spheres inside here as well. So the subject of today is talking all about rendering, and this scene I've already kind of like set up for you guys to an extent. You can see that actually I have kind of like my scene lit up over here. If I change the gamma to 2.2, this might depend a little bit on the monitor that you're using, but specifically for my laptop this seems to allow me to see the colors much better. If you see an image that looks similar to this, just leave the settings as they are right now. So importantly for us, what I'm going to be doing today is that we've been so far rendering images out, and all of the images have been exactly the same in terms of we've been rendering out a final image that we've actually not been using for color correction or moving into another application or using it for VFX or anything. We've kind of like just been focusing on creating one final good image. So I've actually gone through and given you just a few settings here which work kind of well, and I've worked out some of the problems with kind of like how many samples the lights had to have and how many passes the diffuse needed to have in order to reduce a little bit of the noise and all of this other fun technical stuff as well, because today what I want to talk to you guys about is rendering out your images by using either what Arnold calls AOVs, which is arbitrary output values, which we traditionally would have actually called, I believe, render passes per se, if I'm correct. And then there also is the render layers themselves, or some people call them render elements as well. And very much disregard of whatever you call these things, very much there's two ways of thinking about what we're rendering with. Arnold's AOVs, or render passes if you prefer to call them that way, is the fact that what we're rendering out actually is already made as part of the components of what the image actually is. So things like if you're looking for a diffuse pass or you're looking for specular information, all of this type of stuff is computed by Arnold at this point in time to create the final image. So it doesn't increase your render time. You're looking at Arnold splitting up this image into various parts and understanding that you're using kind of like different elements to build up this final image. While as when we're thinking about in Arnold about render layers specifically, or render elements if you call them like that, it's about either selecting certain objects and rendering them in isolation, or doing like an ambient occlusion pass, or you're effectively having to re-render the image to actually create that specific effect per se. So what I'm going to be doing today is that I'm going to show you guys how to set up some AOVs to allow you to have control over rendering out the diffuse, the specular, and the refractiveness, kind of like all separately in their own little passes. And then what I'm going to do is go ahead and show you how to use the new render editor over here, which we've got this render setup window over here that takes over from the render layers, which used to be traditionally inside of Maya, inside of the channel editor, channel box editor. Now, for whatever reason you don't like this system, in whatever way that you don't want to actually use it because you're much more comfortable with the old render settings, in Maya 2017 the old render settings still do exist, so don't worry, those haven't gone anywhere, but you have to go into your preferences over here. I'm just going to click on the icon over here, and inside the Maya Preferences tab over here, if I go into rendering over here, you'll see that the preferred render setup system is currently set to render setup. That's Arnold's render setup window. If you want to use Maya's traditional render layers, again, as I said before, everything's changing names to an extent, but it still pretty much works with the same philosophy in mind as well. So importantly here, we've got ourselves that if we want to use the old render layer system, we can do that, and we'd have to restart Maya. But for today, all I'm going to do is start working out with this image over here. So this tutorial is going to focus very much on the idea of rendering out with the purpose of compositing or color correcting. If you know a little bit of Nuke, this will be fantastic for you, but even if you know a little bit of Photoshop, there's a lot of editing that we can do with our render passes and render layers, and that will be absolutely great for us to be able to do small little changes to our images without having to go back and re-render our entire thing. So let's start off first of all with what do we have in the AOVs. So if I open up my render settings over here, one of the things that's important for us to start rendering before we do anything is to make sure that our settings are set correctly. Now I've got an EXR set up by default as Maya 2017 comes in like that. You might have to change that to another file if necessary. All of the images that I'm going to render today are going to be open EXRs. And then, you choose when you want to render out. If you want a single frame, you choose, of course, name extension, single frame. Name number extension would be great if I was doing animation of any sort, but I'm going to leave it to a single frame just to keep this tutorial very, 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 very short. And again, I need to choose what is my renderable camera. So I'm going to make sure that that is shot cam. And then inside here, I'm going to leave it at a low end HD over here, so all my previews don't take too long, because the bigger the size of the image, the longer the image will take to render per se. And later on I might render out for the final thing just at a slightly higher resolution later on. Okay, so inside these tabs we've played around a lot with the Arnold renderer, but there is this section over here which is called AOVs. Now this, again, some people might call them render passes, are actually the elements which exist, and this is very closely connected in Arnold with the shaders themselves. If you notice over here, there's a whole series of groups, and I have over here my Arnold standard material and the effects that I could possibly render out from this type of material. Now I've made the scene so that everything has got the Arnold standard material, so this is all of them. You can see how flexible that actually is, but I'm interested in editing certain properties, and those properties will be the diffuse, which can be direct or indirect, and the specular, so the actual highlights per se, and the indirect specular as well. And then I'm going to render out the refraction, but for this specific example I didn't use any true reflections as well. So if you actually render out the reflection pass here, you're going to get a black screen completely because there isn't any inside of this scene. So effectively you're just choosing the elements that you actually want to be able to edit. If I had any glowing materials, I could choose an emission property over here. It's important when rendering that you only render out the materials that you need. So this scene only has direct diffuse and direct specular, and it also only has indirect diffuse and indirect specular, and it only has refraction like that as well. Okay, so those are the main 5 AOVs that I'm going to render out, and to add them to my renderer, all I need to do is press this kind of like double line button over here, and you'll see that it adds them into this list down here. Now currently it's going to render out all of these different passes. They're all going to be RGB types of data over here, so they'll have either a no alpha channel embedded into them, and I could also choose to change the file type that they're being rendered to. If I didn't want to work with the XR but I wanted to render to TIFF or to JPEG, I can change them automatically here, and I'm already customizing what this image is going to look like when I press the render button at the end and render out all of my different passes automatically. So now that this is set up, I can still preview what this image actually looks like. So if I come over here and I press the interactive renderer over here and turn this on. I might have to just reload this because I think, nope, there are all my AOVs, fortunately. If you don't see this list here, sometimes you have to close the panel down and open it up again. But if I went into the direct diffuse channel over here, you'll see that the image that I get is ever so slightly different. You'll see that I can see the texture of the box because that's the diffuse color of it. And you'll also see that I can see the gray sphere over here inside of here. But you'll notice that this material over here, which is a chrome sphere that I made with the Arnold standard material, and a glass sphere over here with the glass bottle over here on the left hand side, you'll see that all of those materials that have either high reflectivity or high refractivity actually are black in the diffuse channel, and that's because inside of their own materials, okay, so if I selected, say for example, this sphere over here and I right clicked on it and I went to material attributes, just to bring it up there for a second, what you're going to see is that I have over here, oops, if I choose the, again, chrome material over here, you'll see that the diffuse color is actually set to black. So you'll see that that's the color that will appear in the direct diffuse channel. Now, what do the other channels do? The fun thing about this process is that Maya is still rendering away the whole image while it's going through these AOVs. So if I go over here to the direct specular channel, over here you see I've just see the actual effects of the highlights of the lights which are inside of my scene, and I've made 3 lights for you there, an orange one, a blue one, and a white one on top. And if I go over here to the indirect diffuse, which is what I wanted to click on originally, you're going to see that there is a lot of indirect lighting being casted here. If I wanted to play around with that color bleed property that we've used before in our interior lighting tutorial, you see that this is a way that I can actually take this image and I can actually boost that effect if I wanted to. You'll see that the image is a little bit noisy over here, and if I added more bounce lights over here, I could actually start clearing this up as well. AOVs are a great way of understanding where you need to be increasing certain properties inside of the render settings. So inside the render settings, inside of the Arnold renderer, we do have the diffuse samples over here, and we also have the diffuse rays as well. And the more rays and more samples we get, the smoother the diffuse is going to become. So I might have to boost up these properties later on for actually getting a nice smooth render over here, but this is a great way of debugging this type of stuff. So I'll keep leaving this image kind of like rendering out over here, and we'll go into the indirect specular and see what we can see there. And you'll notice that here what we see is actually the reflections from the environment. You can see actually here the ground plane and a few other details in the chrome sphere very clearly like that. And last but not least, we've got this refraction pass over here, which is really going to focus down on what this sphere and the inside of this bottle actually look like as well. And the big advantage of all of this is that all of these passes kind of like, when slapped together and composed in the right way, will make the beauty pass. So this will still take the same time to render, but it's going to create all of these separate layers for us, which we can open up in Photoshop. So the last thing that I want to point out specifically about this, if I go into any one of the channels like the refraction channel over here, you'll see that this image actually is kind of like completely black and has a little bit of color. But if I press this button over here and I go through the actual channels over here, red, green and blue, you'll see that when I get to the alpha channel, you're going to notice that all of this is white. So it does mean that all of these pixels which are being rendered are not on a transparency. Don't think that that black is going to be transparent. This color actually is going to be black pixels, and we'll have to use some layer blending modes later on in order to make this over here. So all of this stuff has been rendered out nice and good over there, and what I'm going to do next is, before I even play around with any of these settings, I'm going to introduce you guys to a new tool set. Okay, so inside Maya 2017, you've got this little button up here, which is like a little checker pattern, a little clapperboard with some layers on it in the bottom right hand corner, or you can go into Windows, Rendering Editor, and choose the new Render Setup window over here, and that will open this up over here. Now this will make what traditionally was the Maya render layers, and in Maya 2017 we've got a new interface and a new way of working with this. And to make this just a little bit clearer for us, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to open my panels up into 2 like this, and what I'm going to do is just add into this side panel over here my outliner so I can see all of the objects inside of my scene. I'm going to go to Panels, Panel, Outliner over there, and again the outliner is the scene list. Effectively all of my objects which are inside of my scene are inside there, just so that I can have these here. So the way that this works is that this render layers window is going to allow me to actually customize what is being rendered, but every time I use it, it's going to add something to the render. So it means that it will have to do calculations twice. So anything that I add here will increment my render time by just a little bit, depending on what I'm actually rendering out. It's still very, very, very useful. But what we're going to do is I'm going to start off by creating a new render layer, and I'm going to render a specific effect that's called Ambient Occlusion. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to open this layers panel over here, and the render layers system inside of Maya 2017 really forces you to be organized. I've got a layer over here and I'm going to call this AO for Ambient Occlusion, just so that I make that mental note over here. And the way that this works inside of Maya 2017 is that this render layers system will also influence what we see in the viewport as well. If I come over here, it works by creating certain things which are called collections, which if I right click on that layer menu and go to create collection, it's going to create something that's called a collection in here, and this is like a group of objects. I'm going to call this geometry over here, and actually if I type in geometry correctly, it works even better. No, I did spell that correct, I think. Again, always being kind of like a bit doubtful with my spelling per se. I think a lot of creative people get that as well. So this ambient occlusion now needs to be applied to specific objects inside of my scene. And in Maya 2017, they make you put all of your objects into an actual collection like this. Now, this collection specifically, I can add objects to it by just grabbing them effectively from this outliner, and I can just middle mouse button click and drag and add objects into my collection like this. So I've just added the crate object into my collection. If I activate the render layer by pressing this eyedrop tool, you'll see that in the viewport it will show me the objects which are inside of this render layer and effectively hide all of the other objects which are inside here. So when I press this eyedrop tool, this eye tool is showing me what is inside my collection over here. Now, there's a whole other series of ways of adding things to it, and people can think of, oh, it's going to be a lot of hassle to kind of like just grab all of these objects and put them here. But here's where, if you are diligent with how you name the objects inside of your scene, it can be really, really, really easy to do this. Now, there's a few tutorials that show you more about how to do this. I'm going to show you a very easy way, because in my scene, all of the objects that are geometry I've called geo. And what I'm going to do is go into this area over here which says create expression at the top, and I can type the names of certain objects with a little script that will allow me to select it faster. So one of the things that I've done is that if I type in geo and I add an asterisk behind it over here, it will select every object in the outliner in my scene that starts with the word geo. So if I press select over there, you'll see that everything that has geo written over here is actually going to actually highlight, and if I push this add button over here, it's going to add all of those objects into my render layer, and hey presto, here they all are in my viewport. Okay, so if you've named everything in here, it's very easy to bring in all your geometry, bring in all of your lights. But what happens over here with this guy over here, which I've left kind of like purposefully not named with geo at the end of it, I could start by actually typing in BG if I wanted to, but what happens if I missed an object and I need to rename it later on? It doesn't matter. I can just come into here, type in geo at the start over there like that, go back into here, and you'll notice that this script is already running, and again I've just renamed that, and it's automatically brought in the background little plane that I made over here as soon as I renamed it, because this little script is active over here. So it's really, really, really useful that as soon as I rename an object and it has geo in front of it, it will automatically be added into this collection. So the new layer system is very, very, very smart. but it does force you to be a little bit more organized if you want to use it. Or again, you can just drag and drop things in here as well. If you've got very simple scenes, this is a complete piece of cake. So what are we going to do with this render layer? Now it has all of the geometry in my scene. I haven't used any of my lights or any other fancy things that I could do in here as well. What I can do is that I can right click here, and I've got some more options over here with what I can do with the render layer. And what I want to use is use a tool which is called Create Material Override. What this is going to do is that currently my scene has lots and lots and lots and lots of different textures over here, and I want to apply a new texture called Ambient Occlusion over the top of my entire scene without destroying the previous texture work that I've done, which is why I'm making a render layer. So this material override, I'm just going to rename it to material override AO for ambient occlusion over here, and then I can choose a texture inside of this override material, and if I press this little checker pattern over here, it'll bring up my traditional create render node section over here. So what I'm going to do is type in AI, because I'm looking for an Arnold shader, and there is an Arnold Ambient Occlusion shader over here, which is really cool. So I just press that there, and you'll see that in my viewport, everything kind of like changes to gray like this. And again, I've got my render layer active, so when I go into the Arnold render view again, I hopefully should see the effects of the ambient occlusion if I go into the beauty layer over here. And this is what ambient occlusion actually looks like. It's a black and white texture that fills in the entire scene. It's really, really, really useful for creating contact shadows and kind of like highlighting like the dark edges of this box over here as well. And there's a load of interesting settings that we can play around with as well. I'm just going to hide the render layers for just a minute. If you see here in my attribute editor, I've got ambient occlusion, and the great thing about Arnold is that with the interactive renderer, I can actually play around with the settings. If I zoom into this image, I might notice that there actually is some noise inside of this ambient occlusion, so I can increase the samples to 5, and Arnold will re-render what this looks like. If I play around with this spread property over here, you'll see that I can increase the contrast of my ambient occlusion as well, so I can make these contact shadow areas look darker like that. So again, I'm just going to give it like a little value of just a little bit more contrast of about 0.8 over here. And then if I want to play around with properties like the near clip and far clip per se, if I just zoom out of this for just 1 second over here, what I'm going to do is just come into this far clip, and if I increase it, you can see that it starts filling in a little bit of gray around the background over here, so I can actually start seeing the curve of my background plane inside of there. So I'm going to come over here, and actually I don't really want to see that per se, so I'm going to take, whoops, not the spread, but the far clip. I'm just going to bring it down to a value of about 100, maybe a little bit less. Nope, that's too much. There we go. I'm going to do it there for about 120, seems like a good number. There we go. Okay, and if I wanted to do any other changes, I could do that as well and colorize it as I want. But that's kind of like the effect that I'm actually looking for, so I'm quite happy with that ambient occlusion pass. Again, this is possible thanks to the render layers system inside of Maya, which again, if I open it up very briefly and I just turn off this render layer, I have not destroyed any of my work. What happens is I can hopefully just come into here, and hopefully if I can just hit this icon over here, this little eyedrop tool, just having a little bit of trouble with my graphics tablet there for it to actually engage in the right place, you can see that I have my beauty pass already done, and everything looks absolutely great, just like that. So again, this is a very easy way of replacing all of the textures inside of my image with a different texture, like an ambient occlusion pass. So you're going to see that this ambient occlusion pass only took 13 seconds to render, which is not really, a lot in terms of how long a render could actually take, but it's going to be some extra seconds that we're going to add on to our overall render time. Another thing that's quite useful to render out as well, especially for presenting your 3D work, is a wireframe pass as well, because people who see your 3D work, especially employers, are always interested in how you've modeled your actual scenes as well. So if you've got a demo reel or something, it's always good to add breakdowns and little video clips that actually explain how you put the image together, and wireframes are really, really, really useful. So inside the render setup window again, I'm going to create a new layer. So I'm going to come into here and I'm going to select this little layer over here. Just going to close down my render editor to an extent, and this new layer I'm going to call Wireframe, just like that. And then again, I'm going to do the same thing one more time. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to create another collection over here. This collection, again, I'm going to call it Geo as well for geometry. And I'm going to come into here and I'm going to use the same script that I did before, which is Geo, case sensitive, and put a little star in there, hit select, and then just add them into my list like that. So I've already got all of my geometry, bang, slammed in there as well. Again, with the wireframe, I'm not really going to worry about the lights because the material overrides that I'm going to use won't require me to have lights specifically. So if I came over here and selected this and I went into, let's say for example, create material override. Again, this material override is going to be wireframe over there, and I'm going to look for a specific Arnold shader again. So I'm going to click on the checker pattern over here. I'm going to type in AIW for AI wireframe over here, and you'll see that this AI wireframe node over here has some properties inside of it as well. And the good thing about this one, you could use an Arnold utility material to do something very similar as well, but this one actually allows you to customize what the image actually looks like. So if I came over here into my Arnold render view over here, and I made sure that I switch from the Ambient Occlusion layer to be turned on to turn on the wireframe layer over here, you'll see that this looks a little bit weird because all my faces are triangulated like that. What I'm going to do, oops, I just split off the window like that, and actually I can just hopefully redock it like so. Again, new Maya 2017 windows that you can just pull apart by accident, just like that. If I turn this to polygons, you're going to see that now I've actually got the shape of each polygon face, which is going to be much more important. If I was going to use multiply and have dark lines over my objects over here, I'd probably leave it like this, but just to do something a little bit cooler later on, what I'm going to do is that I'm actually going to change the background color to black over here, and I'm going to take my line color and I'm going to use something like a slightly brighter cyanish color like that, like 50% cyan over there, just so that it looks a little bit like Tron, or kind of like one of those old 80s computer movies as well, where everything had the wireframes actually highlighted. So there we go, we've got ourselves our second set of render layers over here, which again is going to be good for presentations as well. And you're going to see again 5 seconds to render that. That's again still very, 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 very useful to us as well. As we move forward, we're going to have to start making some other things inside of here. Currently I'm only using the render layers for creating things that I actually kind of like want to render as a final image, but this system is amazingly powerful as well. You can make layers for your lights and, you know, just change the intensity for them as well, and you can do loads of other fun little things as well. I'm now going to take a moment to start making a material ID node. Now this is really useful for when you're doing kind of like quite complicated compositing, and it's really useful for people who use Nuke or people who use After Effects, because it allows us to create a specific mask that we can select thanks to a color, so that we can have very finite control over the objects inside of our scene. We'll later on be creating a mask, traditional kind of like Photoshop style alpha channel as well, that we can render out, and again this will allow us to have some customizable controls inside of whichever image editing software that we want to use. But if you're specifically looking for how to create material IDs inside of Arnold, this is a great way of actually doing it, and I'm not even sure if it's the only way of doing it. Probably there's other ways as well, so let me know if you know any other techniques down below in the comments. That would be great. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to close down my render editor for for 1 second, but before I do that, I want to actually go back to my beauty pass. So I'm just going to make sure that my render layers are actually turned off like that, just so that I've got the actual image over here. Now, to create material IDs inside of Arnold, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be playing around with these three spheres. I could choose any other combination of objects that I would want to as well inside of my scene, but I'm just going to leave you the most simplest ones to actually work with, so it's quick and quite effective. If I select this sphere over here and right click on it and go in the list down to material attributes and wait for those to load up inside of my actual attribute editor, you're going to see that I'm going to I've made a sphere with a color of like 0.15 over here. I'm just going to copy that value to an extent, but I'll hopefully remember it as well. 3 digits. Oh my god. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new material into the diffuse color over here. I'm going to do that by clicking on the checker pattern over here, and I'm going to look, I might have to click in the Arnold section over here for an attribute that is called AIW Arnold Right Color. Okay, so this right color material over here is going to have two properties, beauty and input over here, and the beauty pass over here is actually going to be the same color as I had before, 0.15 over here, if it's a color that I have selected, you know, like the gray sphere over here. If I had a texture, I would have to connect it into here again, and I could do that in the hypershade or just through the nodes inside of the attribute editor if I wanted to. So the beauty has to be the same color as the diffuse color that we originally had, and then the input we're going to plug in an Arnold utility material. So I'm going to go into AIU. If it doesn't appear, I just click on Arnold to filter that down to actually be my Arnold utility node. I'm going to click on that there, and the Arnold utility, I'm going to change its shaded mode to flat, so it's a completely flat color, and then what I'm going to do is select red as that primary color over there, and that's going to be the start of making my material ID. The only thing I need to do now is to create a custom AOV, again, an arbitrary output value. What I'm going to do is just go up a level by clicking on this button over here, or I could go back to the material selection and work my way down the tree if necessary. And inside here, I've got this name property in right color attributes. So if I click on this here, you'll see that I've got various channels that I can contribute it to. Those are my AOVs. And at the bottom, I've got an option that's called Create New. I'm going to click Create New, and it will ask me to specify a name for my AOV. And Arnold does a really good job at allowing you to create custom AOVs for loads of different effects. So if I come over here, and I'm just going to call this Object ID all together like that, and hit Create. Hopefully the name up here should update to Object ID, and if I go into the render settings by pressing the little clapperboard with the gearbox over here, and I go into my AOVs, I should see that I've got a property over here which is now called Object ID. Okay, so with that all set up, when I go into my Arnold render view again, I should have a new pass inside of my list, which is called Object ID, and if I click on it, you'll see it's a red sphere like this. Now the advantage of this is specifically if I go into the channels over here and I click through this, you're going to see that this material ID actually has in its alpha channel a little mask like this. Okay, so white and black pixels. Anything that's white is going to be solid pixels, anything that's black is going to be transparent, and grays would be kind of like the transition in between them over here. So importantly, this allows me to actually select parts of my image thanks to this color with its own little alpha channel over here as well. You'll also notice that inside here the object ID is an RGBA type of thing, saying it's got red, green, blue colors, and it has an alpha channel. So the great thing about this is that programs like Nuke or After Effects allow you to select specific colors. I'm just going to pull that render layer settings out from there. It just docked again into my screen. That's going to allow me to basically take these specific materials, and if I wanted to adjust like their color or their contrast, I can use those individual color IDs to rapidly select them inside of my compositing program, and I can tweak their values specifically just for that object. We could render out a whole series of these again, but again, just so that you get the idea of how this works, I'm going to make one for the mid-gray sphere, one for the chrome sphere, and another one for the glass sphere. And what I'm going to do is select this one over here, right click, again do the same thing, and I'll come over and I'll choose my material attributes over here, and inside, not mid gray, over here, let me just double click on that again, over here. See, can I have my chrome sphere? Might be because I've got my render layers turned on. That's something that happens as well. So good that I've kind of like bumped into that. No, that's not on there. I thought that I had some form of override maybe happening over here. Let me just go over here back to my render view. Is it because I'm in my object ID? I'm just going to close that down, right click on this here. Not in face mode. It might be because I've instanced these over here. There we go. I can see my Chrome tab over here, and there we go. I actually have my Chrome material over here. I can click on here to do it, or if I'm having specific trouble finding a specific texture, again, just open the hypershade, and you'll be able to see that if I come over here and open up my Chrome material, which is this one over here, and I just map that into my scene like that, I can just come over here and do the same thing in the hypershade. It's pretty much the same thing. Type in AIW to look for an Arnold right to color node. Come in here. The Chrome material doesn't have a color in its beauty path, so that can remain in black. In the input over here, I am going to connect an Arnold utility material, and I'm going to click that there, and I'm going to make the second color green, and the third color I'll make for the other material will be blue. So I'm going to come into here, make sure that that is 100% green, come over here, choose flat over there, and I've got my flat material ID like that. Now the great thing about this as well is that if I come into my Chrome material and I map that so I can show you guys all of the texture nodes inside of here, I'm just going to give myself a little bit more real estate by making my window a little bit bigger like that. You're going to see that what I've effectively done is that I have created a Arnold standard material. Inside the diffuse color, I've plugged in this right to color node, which allows me to have a beauty input and also to have an input over here for a specific AOV. And inside here, when I'm selecting this, again, I can choose to which AOV is this going to be applied to, and I'm going to choose object ID like that. Doesn't look like it's made any changes inside of here, but when I go into Arnold, render view, and I bring up my object ID, you're going to see that now I have a red sphere and I have a green sphere as well. Now, as I mentioned before, these IDs are really useful for high-end compositing, but it's one of those things that you might need or you might not need depending on which other programs you're going to be using. So I've gone along ahead, and just to save you a little bit of repetitiveness, I've gone and I've created a blue material ID as well. And I think specifically for Nuke, people are always very interested in using red, green, and blue as like those primary colors for screen. And you can create multiple kind of like images with loads of different selections based on what you want to have kind of like that finite control over. I have also seen other people use other colors as well, like cyans, yellows, pinks, and stuff like that. You should be able to select the color as well. But the really important thing about this technique is that you see that I can select the different colors and use each one of those as a alpha channel, or all three of them together actually are an alpha channel in and of themselves. You'll see how that applies later on when we go into Photoshop. But Photoshop specifically would want to use a much easier type of alpha channel for creating kind of like transparencies for different objects. And Arnold does this as well in a very easy and fun way as well, which is actually it creates a opacity map effectively, which will be a black and white image which we can use as we can use masks inside of Photoshop. So to set up this paths again, I'm going to use the best of both worlds right now, where I'm going again to create another collection inside of my render layers. So I'm going to open the layer setup, the render setup panel again over here. I'm going to make myself a new render setup over here, and this one I'm going to call it alpha for alpha channel effectively. And again, just going to make sure that that's lowercase. There we go. I'm going to then create a collection as we did before. This is also going to be geo, except that this geo over here is going to be everything except my background plane. So instead of using the script, I'm just going to right click over here on the 5 pieces of geometry, throw that in there, turn on my visibility over here so I can actually see what the alpha channel is actually doing over here, And oops, if I turn that on, there we go. So I now have all of the objects like that selected in my scene over here, and I'm not really going to do a material override on this. I'm just going to leave it the way it is, and if you wanted to, you could render this out as an AXR and everything behind the crates would be transparent as well. There's many ways of building up these images, and as you get more into kind of like what you want to edit, you get a little bit more specific about, oh, I want to render out these specific elements separately or other stuff like that. So I'm basically using a render layer right now to choose the objects which I'm actually going to be rendering out over here. And then what I'm going to do is create a new AOV as well. So I'm going to come into the render settings over here, and aside from the AOVs that are available for the Arnold standard material, we also have this one at the top, which is a built-in material as well. You'll see that IDs is something that we can configure inside of here as well. There also is a normals pass. There also is a z-depth pass, which people like using for depth of field. You do need to have you do need to use Nuke in order to make this work straight out of the box. But down here, again, they should be in alphabetical order. There is an opacity map inside of here. If I add this into my lists over here like that, this will again add it to the active AOVs over here. So hopefully that should appear in my list at some point. And the other thing that we can play around with, let's have a look. Let me just close that and refresh it for a second. Boom, boom, boom. My opacity hopefully should be in the active list. I can't see it down. Oh, there it is, opacity. And you'll see it also is an RGB type of object inside of there. Okay. Now, specifically, if I take any of these built-in objects, they tend to be things that you can't see inside of the image. So for example, if I choose the Z for Z depth and I added that into my scene over here, you'll see that this Z depth object over here, it's actually not an RGB image, but it actually is a float based value instead. It's the way that the camera could measure distances of the objects from the nearest object to the camera to the furthest object in the camera, and Nuke does a really good job at actually just creating a z-depth file from this file with no problems whatsoever. But again, I'm not going to render it out because it would just be like a solid red type of image if I opened it up in Photoshop. So I'm just going to unload that, and these are all the passes that I'm going to use. So I've got some render layers, I've got myself some AOVs as well, and now I can start thinking about rendering out the final version of that image, which is hopefully everything all together. So let's go about rendering out this entire scene, and to do that, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to switch from the modeling toolkit to the rendering toolkit over here, and that will change the options available for me in the top menu up here. Inside the render, traditionally we've always used the batch render control, but now for Arnold we've got this render sequence tool inside here. And what I'm going to do is press this button over here to open up the advanced features inside of here, and you're going to see that one of the things that I want to tick on is to have all of my layers actually rendered over here. And again, importantly, this render sequence by default will follow the settings that are inside of this common tab over here. Again, the file format. Again, making sure that I'm rendering out a single frame with a name and an extension number behind it as well. And if I wanted to now, I could change it to any other resolution that I could be working to, 720, 580, all of the HD formats that I could be using. So I'm going to either choose HD 720 or choose 1080 over here, and again it will show me how much the size in pixels is. Don't try to render things that are amazingly large and then just reduce them in whatever program you want. Try to render out a setting that is either good for YouTube or for other things, and so I'm just going to render it out at 720 because that's what my videos are currently going out of until kind of like I have a little bit of time to play around with Camtasia and I see if I can actually get them into 1080 at least. So what I'm going to do, so I've just skipped ahead a little bit and I've rendered out all of my scenes, and if I open them up inside of my viewer over here, you'll see that I'm rendering out all these different folders over here. Specifically, my master layer will contain all of my AOVs. My then specific render layers will be contained in the alpha, the AO, and the wire. And currently I've made kind of like a few more folders than I actually needed. All the information for the different files will actually be inside of the beauty folder over here. So if I'm looking for the ambient occlusion, the alpha, or the wireframe, I'll do that. Make sure you're rendering from the correct shot cam as well. I had to put my viewport in Maya to actually have my camera in view to render it out, so just be careful with that in case it snags you up. And I also made a little mistake with the alpha as well, where when I rendered it out, I actually rendered out an individual EXR as well, which if I just open that up in Photoshop, it'll ask me if I want to render this out as a transparency or as an alpha channel, and actually I'm going to choose to open this specific one as an alpha channel. I could do transparency on all the other ones because I actually made a colored version of this, and if I open up my alpha channel over here, you'll see that actually this was the image that I actually wanted to create. So that's a little mistake on my behalf, because I've basically made, my alpha channel is there, but I actually rendered out an RGB version of it as well. So I'll take this and I'll press Control A on my keyboard, or Apple A to select everything, and then press Control A, Control C, and inside of my layers panel here, I'll just paste in this alpha channel just in case I need it later on. And I'll come over here and I'll just call this alpha, just like that. Okay, so now I've got quite a few layers inside of my scene like this, all renamed over here. And all of these layers over here should allow me to edit my image as I see fit, per se. So importantly, if I turn on the bottom layer over here and I'm looking at the diffuse direct light over here as well, you'll see that there's no color inside of these areas over here. And then if I've got my indirect diffuse pass over here, you'll see that what happens is that if I change this to another blending mode, I can actually start recreating what the original beauty pass actually looked like, but I can choose to modify things ever so slightly. One thing that I'm going to do with this file as well is that you'll see that when you open up an EXR, in my specific version of Photoshop, you'll see that there actually has kind of like some of the layer blending modes turned off. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to reduce the resolution of the image colors by going into mode and changing it from a 32-bit image to a 16-bit. I'll choose not to merge any of this so that all of my layers are the same, and it will just run through all of this and kind of like colorize all of my layers. But now I'll have full access to all of these settings over here as well. If you're working in Nuke, you won't have a problem like this at all. So what I'm going to do is that in the indirect diffuse, I need to choose how these things are going to start mixing. And say, for example, if I choose a screen blend over here, you're going to see that I am lightening up my image like this. Effectively, I'm creating more indirect bounces inside of my scene as well. And one of the cool things about working in Photoshop is that with this opacity setting, you can choose how much the contribution of the indirect diffuse actually is inside of your scene like this, and you can see it brighten up. If we want to push it further than 100%, what we can do is that we can actually duplicate these layers as well. So if I come over here and I duplicate it like that, I can actually double the amount of indirect illumination which is inside of my scene. And again, I can adjust this ever so slightly like that as well. So I can kind of like really tweak the colors and the balance of all of this just like that. And again, it's really, really, really easy to actually do this. I could spend a lot of time playing around with my lighting settings inside of Maya to get this just right, but thanks to working inside of Photoshop, and I'll just make that kind of like as big as I possibly can on my screen like that so that you guys can see it very clearly, you'll see that I've got now again this very finite control for deciding how this image is going to look. Now again, screen works good for anything that has illumination. You could mess around with playing around with this, but again, you're going to see that there's some settings like add, which are really bright, and other stuff like that. All of the ones which are in this section over here, kind of like from lighten to light and color, they all increase the amount of pixel light there is in actually the image. So if I come to something like the ambient occlusion, this guy over here, this is great for creating contact shadows and darkening specific parts of the image up. And this ambient occlusion file, if I turn it on, this tends to work very good with either a multiply setting over here, just like that, or it will actually work very well also with an overlay as well. Oh, except it's making everything a lot brighter. You might need a little bit of a alpha kind of like mask for this one, specifically if you're using this. I'm going to leave it to multiply, as you can see over here. If I want to see this effect a little bit clearer, I'm going to look for my refractivity map over here, and you see that I've got the color of the bottle and I've got the color of the glass over here. And again, this is a nice one to, I think, either screen or add. Will make this look fairly nice like that. It's going to take all the black pixels and make them transparent, and anything that's light and colored will actually come into here. So I'm using just a screen here, just so that I can see the bottom of this bottle over here and the bottom of the glass as well alongside these guys here. So now if I turn on my ambient occlusion, again I'm just going to turn that on and off, you're going to notice that the shadows in this area get kind of like a lot more kind of like pronounced per se. Again, I can play around very finely with how transparent my ambient occlusion layer is over here, and I can make it clearer and clearer, and I can make it darker and darker as I need to, just like that. Even if I wanted to as well, another thing I could do, if I just single out the ambient occlusion for a second, if I took this layer specifically and I colorized it slightly by pressing Ctrl U to bring up the hue saturation controls, and press colorized over here, added a little bit of saturation over here just to add kind of like the most subtlest of like blue little tints like that, and then I'm just going to hit OK for now and turn on my refractivity and my indirect kind of like lights over here, just like that. You can see that I can add just a little bit of a blue tint to the shadows over here, and that's going to really mix well with the little sphere over here as well, which has some opaque, some translucent shadows inside here as well. So I've just added a little bit of color to my scene, very, 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 very subtly again. And again, it's great that in Photoshop I've got this level of control that I can use just to really play around with my image, just like that. Going forward, again, things like the specular direct, which are the highlights over here. Sorry, that's the indirect. This is the one, hopefully, that I'm looking for. The specular direct light over here, which I'll just throw on top of the refractivity. So leave the refractivity behind, and let's bring the specular in front of those. Actually, even in front of the ambient occlusion probably will do a better job than what I had in mind, like so. Okay. So I've started reshuffling my layers over here, and now I've finally got my direct specular, actually, which is the hard highlights over here, in the right place on my image over here. So what I can do with this is currently I can keep using my layer blending modes as well, but if I had an alpha channel as well that specifically would only work with these pixels, that would be quite useful for me as well. So I could make a selection based on a color sample if I wanted to, and go kind of like into select over here and choose something like a color range and choose kind of like all of the dark pixels per se, you know, and I could remove them like that. There's just a little bit of gray left over like that. But when I kind of like take this and I apply this to screen, you're going to see again that we're going to be left only with those pixels over there, just like that. And if I wanted to kind of like just add a little bit of color to these highlights as well, and specifically control what they look like as well, well, I could do that either in the screen mode specifically, or again I can just start playing around with the actual values of these colors. So if I kind of like played around with them a little bit, I think I'd probably have to have some very dark tones over here. Can I actually view them like that? And again, can I add some saturation to these over here? If I wanted to have kind of like a little bit of an orange tint over here, I could just manipulate that ever so slightly like that. But I've got to be careful that I'm not introducing colors into other areas like that. Most of the time I would try to avoid cutting things out, and I would just work with the actual settings themselves. So I'm going to change this to add over here to create a very bright highlight over here, and I'm just going to knock it up and down just a little bit like that. Perfect. Okay, then what I'm going to do is come into the specular indirect, which is the reflections that are around over here of the environment, which appear in the bottle over here, and I'm going to come over here and I'm going to choose screen like that. So now I've got just a little bit of that there, and if I wanted to, I could just boost the saturation of those highlights over there just a little bit to make the image just a little bit richer like that. And again, just knock it maybe down just a tiny amount like that. Perfect. Okay, so I've got myself kind of like all of these nice little highlights over here, and here's where my alpha can come in quite useful as well. So if I've got my alpha channel selected like this over here, one of the things I can do is that if I copy this alpha, I can stick it in as a mask into any one of these layers. So if I took something like, let's say, this bottle over here, which currently has like some very strong kind of edges over here. I'm just going to make a selection around this area over here, and let's say if I wanted to blur these edges just a little bit like that. I'm going to exaggerate it a little bit so that you guys can see it in the camera view just a little bit better as well. Normally I wouldn't go this far, but again, just so that you see, I'm going to go to blur, and I'm going to choose something like a motion blur to an extent. I'm going to put the angle at 0 over here, and actually I didn't want to apply that straight away, so I'm going to come over here again and go to blur, motion blur. I'm at 0 pixels over here, and again I'm going to look at this over here, and that's the specular indirect channel. I want the specular direct channel over here. There we go, third time lucky, there we go. So I'm going to go to motion blur here. There we go, you can see that I'm actually blurring those highlights over there. I'd normally do it just like a few pixels per se, like make it really subtle, but I'm just going to do it enough so that you can actually see that I'm getting some ghosting going around the bottle like that. So I'm going to do 12 pixels. Again, that's way too much, but just so that you guys can see an example of what we can do with this. And what I can do is that I still have hopefully selected my alpha channel over here. So if I go into my specular direct and I press the add mask button inside of Photoshop over here, I'll just make sure that that thing here is not selected, and again just add my mask over here, so my mask is a solid set of white pixels there. If I press and hold down the Alt key or the Option key inside of a Macintosh and I click on the mask, I'm going to view the actual mask inside of Photoshop over here. So if I zoom out, you see it's all currently white pixels, but if I paste by pressing Ctrl V on my keyboard over here, you're going to see that I'm now pasting in the alpha channel into this mask section over here. So if I now come into here and I zoom into that bottle, I've just softened off those highlights over here, you can see that, but now the mask is actually cropping out all of the pixels that were there. So if I unlink the mask for a sec over here, do I actually see the difference? But you should see that actually now only the elements over here inside of the mask are actually visible. And again, I'm just going to take this over here, I'm just going to move it along. You can see that that's that mask edge over there. So again, using just a mask to select specifically the area that we actually want to add in. So as we're creating kind of like blurs or little retouches or stuff like that, or again, if I had made a render pass with only the wine color inside here, I could very accurately tweak what this actually looks like per se inside of the bottle as well, which specifically if I went into the refraction panel over here and only focused on this layer, I could also go into Photoshop and make selections and stuff like that, but it's so much easier if you make the correct render passes. So all of these techniques kind of like allow us to actually change parts of the image really quickly. And again, thanks to us being able to select things, we can kind of like create and customize what our final image is going to look like. For presentation purposes, and again, just to finish off with my little kind of like Tron colored kind of thing over here, again, wireframes, if they're black on white, that would be fine. So probably something that looks a little bit more like this would be much more appropriate for what we want to do. And basically I'd come into here if it was black on white, and I'd just come into multiply over here, and you'd see that I have kind of like just a wireframe overlaid over there. But again, because I wanted to do something a little bit different like that, and that again gives you a little bit of an unexpected result, I've just pressed Control and I on my keyboard to again invert the colors in Photoshop. If I come over here into my wireframe, and let me just say that I choose something like screen over here, you're going to see that I'm overlaying kind of like a white highlight, which will mix with the colors inside of my scene as well. Looks a little bit weird in these sections over here, so I could come over here and play around a little bit with my levels if I wanted to, and just see, boom, 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 that I can make maybe the colors just a little bit brighter, brighter, like that. And as I said before, just having a little bit of a wireframe on top of your model is a good way of kind of like showing it off to people to so you can demonstrate how you've actually modeled things. But as I said before, just actually having black kind of like and just having kind of like an overlay that's dark like this normally works much better. It sometimes depends on what your scene actually looks like as well. And again, remember that you can soften this effect as well by adding a little bit more transparency to it if you so choose to, rather than rendering it out all over again. So as all of this stuff is completely optional as well, please remember that it's very, very, very important for us that we can take kind of like all of these elements and really, really, really get to customize what the image actually looks like inside of any image manipulation program like Photoshop, or inside of a compositing program like Nuke, or in a very simple way inside of After Effects as well, because all of these passes will work with stills like this, but it's much, much more interesting when you're actually playing around with animations, because as the camera moves across your scene, you're effectively creating Photoshop in motion with Nuke. So that's a little bit of a look at the render passes inside of Maya. We've very much been talking about creating AOVs, which are kind of like the main passes, which are for the diffuse, the specular, the refractivity in this case, and we've also looked at creating custom passes as well with the render layers system inside of Maya 2017, which can allow me to create material overrides and create a whole series of custom looks. When we bring things into Photoshop, we can go ahead and start manipulating things to a very, very, very high level of precision as well, and we could move all of this information into other compositing programs as well. So thanks very much for spending another week with me. Things have been a little bit slower this week because of tiredness, sleep deprivation, and a little bit of feeling under the weather as well, so I've given you this tutorial just a little bit later in the week, but hopefully you'll enjoy it as well. And thanks very much for staying in touch on the channel. Thank you very much for sending those comments, and especially thank you very much for subscribing as well. You guys have been absolutely great at keeping me going, and I'm hoping to get a few more of these tutorials out to you guys very, very, very soon. So until then, I suggest you guys to keep learning and keep looking at all the other software that you can use to actually create fantastic 3D imagery, and I'll be back hopefully next week, and I'll be able to get you guys another Maya tutorial. So until then, keep learning and keep strong, and I will see you next time. Take care.